Most people think the Plaza became famous because it sits at Fifth Avenue in Central Park, dressed in limestone like a crowned bride. But the real secret is that it learned to survive by refusing to stay a hotel. It survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, 9 ownership changes, and bankruptcy, not by being the nicest room in New York, but by becoming a role in America's imagination. A place where a child can belong, where a band can conquer a city, where a movie can borrow your life. So how do you turn a building into a legend that never checks out? The palace that needed an audience. On opening night in 1907, the lobby was not just full, it was performing. Chandeliers threw light like applause. Marble columns rose like stage curtains. Every guest who entered became part of a living tableau, arranged by design to be watched. The Plaza did not open quietly. It announced itself with 800 rooms, 18 stories, and $12 million worth of audacity, planted at the edge of Central Park. The architects, Henry Hardenberg, had built a French Renaissance castle for Americans who wanted European fantasy without crossing an ocean. But this was never about shelter. The Plaza was a theater that charged admission by the night. Its business model was simple and ruthless. Sell status, not beds. Make people pay to be seen. The opening night guest list read like a census of America's new aristocracy. Vanderbilts, Astors, Goulds, names that had turned railroads and steel into bloodlines. They came because the Plaza promised them something hotels had never offered before: permanence. Not just a room for a season, but a stage for a lifetime. The lobby became a proving ground. If you could afford a suite, you belonged. If you could not, the doorman made sure you knew it before you touched the brass. The early playbook was spectacle. The Plaza hosted debutante balls that made newspapers. It threw charity galas that moved money through Manhattan, like water through pipes. It became the address where society went to perform society. Every event was press bait. Every arrival was theater. The building fed on attention the way a fire feeds on air. The architecture itself enforced the hierarchy. Public rooms gilded and grand, designed to impress strangers. Private suites tailored for comfort, but only for those who earned entry. The Palm Court became a stage within a stage, where afternoon tea was less about refreshment and more about being photographed. The Persian Room, later, would serve the same function for a different generation. The Plaza understood something most buildings never learn. Location matters, but performance matters more. By 1910, the hotel was already famous, not because it was the tallest or the largest, but because it made itself necessary to the rituals of the wealthy. Weddings, anniversaries, business deals sealed over brandy in leather chairs. The Plaza did not just host these moments. It claimed them. It became the place where important things happened, and that belief, once planted, became self-sustaining. But hunger grows with feeding. The building demanded more press, more parties, more famous names walking through its doors. It had tasted relevance, and relevance, once experienced, becomes an addiction. The question forming even then, in those first golden years, was whether a building could stay young by becoming a symbol. Whether a hotel could survive not by being the best, but by being the story people told about what the best looked like. The Plaza made its first ruthless choice in those early years. It chose spectacle over privacy. It invited the cameras in. It let the press document every gala, every arrival, every scandal that unfolded in its ballrooms. Other hotels guarded their guests. The Plaza understood that mystery dies in darkness, but legend grows in light. By 1915, the pattern was set. The building was no longer just a business. It had become a monument to its own fame, and monuments once built demand constant worship or they crumble into irrelevance. When luxury became a target. War does not care about chandeliers, and yet chandeliers are exactly what people resent in a crisis. When America entered the First World War in 1917, the mood turned. Opulence became obscene overnight. The same ballrooms that once celebrated excess now felt like evidence of moral failure. Newspapers that had praised the Plaza for its grandeur began questioning whether any building needed gilded ceilings while soldiers died in trenches overseas. The building felt the shift like a change in atmospheric pressure. The crowds did not disappear, but the applause turned uncertain. The Plaza faced a problem it had never considered. How do you look rich without looking guilty? Management made adjustments, smaller galas, quieter press, charity events that raised money for the war effort, staged carefully to signal patriotism without abandoning luxury. The building learned to whisper instead of shout. It dimmed its lights, not because it had to, but because being seen trying too hard would be worse than not being seen at all. This was the first test of survival, not against bombs or fire, but against public opinion. The Plaza had to prove it could read the room. The war years taught the hotel a lesson that would define its future. Relevance is not permanent. Taste shifts. What the public loves today, it can hate tomorrow, and a building that depends on affection must learn to shapeshift without losing its core. The Plaza began practicing a delicate art. It remained grand but acted humble. It kept the chandeliers but talked about sacrifice. It survived by becoming what people needed it to be, not what it wanted to be. By 1918, when the war ended, the building had weathered its first moral reckoning. But the reprieve was temporary. The 1920s arrived like a fever dream. Jazz, bootleg liquor, new money that cared nothing for old rules. The Plaza tried to ride the wave. It hosted parties that tested the limits of prohibition without quite breaking them. It let speakeasy culture seep into its basements while keeping the lobby respectable. The building split itself in two: daylight elegance, midnight rebellion. But even as the parties roared, something shifted in the foundation. The Plaza was no longer the only monument to luxury. New hotels rose along Fifth Avenue: the Sherry Netherland, the Pierre, the Carlyle. Competition meant the Plaza could no longer rely on novelty. It had to justify its prices and its prestige every single season. The building began to understand that fame is not a destination. It is a performance that never ends. The Great Depression arrived in 1929 like a trapdoor opening beneath the city. Fortunes vanished, suites emptied. The Plaza watched its guest list shrink as bankruptcies spread through the same families who had danced in its ballrooms 20 years earlier. Occupancy rates fell. Bills mounted. For the first time since opening, the building faced a question it could not charm its way past. What happens when the audience can no longer afford the show? The answer was compromise. The Plaza began accepting longer-term residents. It converted some floors into semi-permanent apartments for families who needed the address more than they needed the service. It was a quiet retreat from pure hotel status, a tacit admission that survival mattered more than purity. The building bent, but it did not break. It learned to make money from people who wanted to live inside the fantasy year-round, not just visit it for a weekend. By 1940, the Plaza had survived 2 decades of chaos. War, boom, collapse. Each crisis forced a new negotiation with its own identity. But the building always returned to the same essential bargain: attention at any cost, perception before profit. The question forming now, as a second world war gathered on the horizon, was whether discretion could ever truly protect opulence, or whether luxury would always be a target when the world turned dark. The city ate what it built. As Manhattan learned speed, the Plaza learned fear, the fear of becoming an antique while still breathing. The post-war years arrived with a rush of modernity that made 1907 feel like ancient history. Cars replaced carriages. Highways cut through neighborhoods. Airlines made European travel accessible to the middle class. The Plaza watched as the very premise it was built on began to erode. Why stay at a French palace in New York when you could fly to the real thing for less money and more authenticity? The building had always sold fantasy, but fantasy only works when reality is out of reach. New competitors understood the changing market. They built taller, sleeker, more efficient. They embraced mid-century design. They offered modern amenities the Plaza could not match without gutting its own identity. Air conditioning that actually worked. Bathrooms that did not require calling maintenance. Elevators that did not creak like old bones. The Plaza was trapped between two impossible choices: modernize and lose the historic grandeur that made it special, or stay frozen in time and watch younger hotels steal the future. Operating costs climbed every year. Maintaining limestone, marble, gilded ceilings, and antique fixtures required small armies of craftsmen. The Plaza employed hundreds of staff to keep 18 floors running: doormen, bellhops, housekeepers, engineers who understood how to fix heating systems designed before anyone thought about efficiency. Every chandelier needed cleaning. Every carpet needed replacing. Every window needed washing by hand. The building devoured money just to stay standing. The early dominance was peaking, but cracks were showing in the facade. Ownership began to cycle. The original investors were aging out. New buyers saw the Plaza as a trophy asset, but trophies cost more to maintain than they generate in rent. The mathematics of prestige were becoming unsustainable. A famous address meant higher expectations, not higher profits. Guests who paid top dollar demanded perfection, and perfection, delivered every single night, bleeds a building dry. The city itself was changing shape around the hotel. Midtown became the center of corporate power. Wall Street firms and advertising agencies moved north. The Plaza sat at the geographic edge of the new business district, close enough to be convenient, but far enough to feel separated from the machinery of modern commerce. It was a location problem no amount of charm could fix. Business travelers wanted efficiency. They wanted to be steps from their meetings, not a long walk through Central Park. The Plaza tried to adapt. It marketed itself to tourists who wanted the New York experience. It hosted conventions and corporate events. It rented out ballrooms for weddings that grew larger and louder with each passing year. But every pivot felt like dilution. The building had built its reputation on exclusivity, and exclusivity dies the moment you open the doors too wide. By 1960, the Plaza was still famous, still beautiful, still iconic. But fame without profit is just expensive nostalgia. The hotel was no longer growing, it was holding ground. And in a city that rewarded expansion and innovation, holding ground felt like losing. The building stood at the height of its cultural prestige, a landmark everyone recognized and fewer people could afford. The first act was closing. The long slide was beginning. What the Plaza had not yet realized was that its survival would depend on a counterintuitive gamble. It would have to give itself away to the public imagination completely, to become so deeply embedded in culture that owning it, living in it, or even visiting it would feel secondary to simply knowing it existed. The building would have to become a story before it could remain a structure. The foundation had been laid. The audience had been assembled. But the performance that would save the plaza had not yet been written. And when it arrived, it would come from the most unlikely source imaginable. A 6-year-old girl with a turtle and too much confidence. Behind the gold, the math bleeds. Every velvet curtain has a monthly bill, and the plaza's bills never stopped climbing. This is where the fairy tale ends and the ledger begins. Behind every gilded surface lives a cost structure that most guests never see, and most owners never survive. The plaza, for all its elegance, was bleeding money in ways that could not be fixed with better marketing or higher prices. The arithmetic of historic preservation is merciless. Every original detail that makes a building special also makes it expensive to maintain. Every antique fixture requires a specialist. Every handcrafted element cannot be replaced with something cheaper from a catalog. The hotel employed over 600 people at its peak. Doormen worked in shifts around the clock. Housekeeping teams cleaned 800 rooms, each one requiring fresh linens, polished brass, and attention to details that modern hotels had automated away. The kitchen staff prepared meals for multiple restaurants, room service, and banquet events, all operating simultaneously in a warren of subterranean prep areas designed in an era before commercial refrigeration. The plaza was not one business. It was 20 businesses stacked on top of each other, each with its own payroll, supply chain, and operational nightmare. Maintenance costs alone would have bankrupted a smaller property. The limestone facade required constant attention. Acid rain, pollution, and simple weathering ate away at the stone. Every few years, sections needed replacing or repointing, work that required scaffolding, skilled masons, and months of labor. Inside, the mechanical systems were antiques, boilers that heated, water for hundreds of bathrooms, electrical wiring that predated building codes, plumbing that groaned and leaked behind walls that could not be easily opened without damaging historic plaster. The plaza opened in 1907 with $12 million in construction costs. Over the following decades, it survived 2 world wars that disrupted supply chains and labor markets. It endured the Great Depression, which emptied its rooms and forced discounts that undermined its premium positioning. It weathered 9 ownership changes, each new buyer inheriting deferred maintenance and outdated infrastructure. It faced one bankruptcy that exposed the gap between its cultural value and its balance sheet. And through it all, it had to look flawless every single night, because a luxury hotel cannot admit struggle without destroying the fantasy it sells. Ownership turnover became a pattern. Investors bought the plaza assuming its fame would translate into profit. They renovated. They rebranded. They hired new management teams with fresh strategies. But within 5 to 7 years, the same problems resurfaced. Operating costs exceeded revenue. Maintenance backlogs grew. The building demanded more than it could generate, and the only way to bridge the gap was to find a wealthier buyer willing to absorb the loss for the prestige of owning an icon. This created a perverse incentive structure. The plaza became valuable precisely because it lost money in interesting ways. It was a trophy asset for real estate developers who needed a crown jewel in their portfolio. It was a branding opportunity for hotel chains that wanted to add a historic name to their corporate identity. But it was never, in any conventional sense, a profitable hotel. The numbers did not work. They had not worked for decades. And yet the building survived. because someone always believed they could be the owner who finally cracked the code. Who actually profits from a legend? Not the people who own it. Not the guests who pay premium rates and still feel like they are getting a bargain compared to the intangible value of the experience. The Plaza profited the city, which used it as a landmark and a symbol. It profited the culture, which used it as shorthand for aspiration and elegance. It profited everyone except the people signing the checks to keep the lights on. The hidden reality of the Plaza was that it had become a public good masquerading as a private business. Its survival depended on finding owners wealthy enough to subsidize a building that the public believed it owned by right of collective imagination. This tension between private ownership and public possession would define every decision made about the hotel for the next half-century. The balance sheet told one story. The Plaza was a financial disaster, but the cultural ledger told another. It was priceless, and in the gap between those two truths, the building found its path forward. It would have to become so essential to the idea of New York that letting it fail would be unthinkable. It would have to make itself indispensable not to travelers, but to dreamers. And that transformation began not with a business strategy, but with a children's book, The Child Who Saved a Giant. After 1945, a strange idea spread through the suites. Let children claim the place too. The Plaza had always been an adult fantasy, a place where grown men made deals and grown women wore gowns that cost more than cars. Children were tolerated but rarely centered. They were expected to behave like small adults, quiet and invisible in the dining rooms and lobbies. But something shifted in the post-war years. A recognition, perhaps, that childhood itself had become a market. That nostalgia could be manufactured by planting memories early. That a child who loved the Plaza would grow into an adult who spent money there. Kay Thompson, a singer and actress, created Eloise in 1955. A 6-year-old girl who lived at the Plaza with her nanny, her dog, and her turtle. Eloise was rambunctious, inventive, and utterly uncontrollable. She treated the hotel like a personal playground. She ordered room service at 3 in the morning. She pranked the staff. She knew every secret corridor and service elevator. The books were illustrated by Hilary Knight, whose drawings captured the Plaza's grandeur while making it feel approachable, almost cozy, through a child's eyes. The Plaza could have ignored the books. They were fiction, after all, and fiction about a badly behaved child at that. But management made a calculated choice. They embraced Eloise. They installed a portrait of her in the lobby. They created an Eloise suite that families could book. They sold merchandise in the gift shop. Eloise became the Plaza's unofficial mascot, a character who gave the hotel permission to be playful without losing its sophistication. This was not an accident. This was brand strategy disguised as whimsy. The Eloise phenomenon widened the audience without lowering the price. Families who could never afford a suite could buy a book. Children who would never stay at the hotel could still dream about it. The Plaza planted itself in the imagination of an entire generation, knowing that those children would grow up associating the hotel with joy, adventure, and a sense of belonging. When they became adults with disposable income, where would they want to celebrate anniversaries, close business deals, or host their own children? The Plaza had colonized their memories decades in advance. But the Eloise strategy did something even more valuable. It made adult luxury feel safer, warmer, less intimidating. If a child could belong at the Plaza, then so could anyone. The hotel softened its image without cheapening it. It remained exclusive, but the exclusivity no longer felt purely economic. It felt emotional, aspirational in a way that did not require a trust fund. You could visit the lobby, buy a croissant in the Palm Court, take a photograph with the Eloise portrait, and feel like you had touched something magical without spending thousands of dollars on a room. The books also provided cover for operational realities. The Plaza needed to attract a broader customer base to survive. Corporate travelers, tour groups, families saving for one special weekend, but admitting that need would have damaged the brand. Eloise gave the hotel a narrative reason to welcome everyone. "We are not desperate," the building seemed to say. "We are generous. We have always loved children." The truth was more complex. The Plaza loved survival, and children were a market segment it could no longer afford to ignore. Strange things began to happen around the Eloise promotion. Staff reported hearing laughter in empty corridors late at night, high-pitched and musical, echoing off marble and fading before anyone could locate the source. Guests in certain suites claimed to see shadows moving in, periphery vision, small and quick, gone the moment they turned to look. The hotel never confirmed these stories, but it never quite denied them either. A little mystery, carefully cultivated, added to the allure. The grounded explanation was simpler. Old hotels are full of sounds, pipes expanding, floors settling, voices from other rooms carrying through ventilation shafts in unexpected ways. The human brain, primed by suggestion, fills in gaps with familiar patterns. Tell someone a 6-year-old ghost might live in the building, and suddenly every creak becomes a footstep. Every draft becomes a presence. Expectation shapes perception, and the Plaza understood that a ghost story, left ambiguous, could be better marketing than any advertisement. Tours began to include the Eloise portrait as a mandatory stop. School groups visited. Parents bought their daughters Eloise dolls and books in the gift shop, then took photographs in the lobby to prove they had been there. The Plaza became a pilgrimage site for childhood nostalgia, even for people whose own childhoods had never included anything close to luxury. The hotel had achieved something remarkable. It had made itself emotionally necessary to people who had never spent a single night under its roof. By 1960, the Eloise strategy was paying dividends in ways accountants could not measure. The Plaza was no longer just a hotel, it was a story. And stories, unlike buildings, can survive bankruptcy, ownership changes, and the brutal economics of historic preservation. The question forming now, as the 1960s accelerated into chaos and cultural revolution, was whether imagination could do what money could not. Whether a building could stay alive by living in the minds of strangers, and whether that kind of survival, divorced from the original purpose, was resilience or a quieter kind of surrender. The answer would arrive in 1964, delivered not by a child with a turtle, but by 4 young men from Liverpool who would turn the Plaza into an amplifier for global hysteria. The night the world moved in. In 1964, the Plaza hosted the Beatles, and the hotel became an amplifier for global hysteria. The phone calls started before the band even boarded the plane. American girls, thousands of them, trying to book rooms, bribe staff, find any excuse to get inside the building the moment word leaked that the Beatles would be staying there. The Plaza had hosted celebrities before, actors, politicians, European royalty, but this was different. This was a cultural earthquake, and the building sat directly on the fault line. The band arrived on February 7th. Crowds surrounded the building within hours, screaming, chanting, holding signs. Police erected barricades, but the noise penetrated anyway. Through the limestone walls, through the double-paned windows, into the suites where the Beatles tried to rest between television appearances and rehearsals. The Plaza had never experienced anything like this. Fame, yes. Attention, always. But this was something new. This was frenzy, organized and relentless, and it transformed the hotel into the center of a global event. The Beatles held a press conference in one of the ballrooms. Reporters packed the room. Flashbulbs fired like artillery. The band answered questions with wit and charm, but the real story was the location. The Plaza gave the event legitimacy. It said, "These are not just pop musicians. These are important enough to be here, in the building where presidents and industrialists have walked." The hotel lent its credibility to youth culture, and youth culture, in return, dragged the Plaza into the modern age. Management could have shut it down, could have refused the booking, citing noise complaints or security concerns. Other hotels had. But the Plaza made a different calculation. It saw an opportunity, not just to collect room fees, but to become part of a moment that would define a decade. The building opened its doors to chaos, and in doing so, it proved something essential. Exclusivity is worthless if no one is paying attention. The Plaza chose electricity over privacy, relevance over reputation, and the gamble paid off in ways that compounded over decades. Photographs from that weekend circulated for years. The Beatles waving from Plaza windows, crowds surging against police lines on Fifth Avenue. The hotel became synonymous with the British invasion, the moment when American popular culture tilted on its axis. Anyone who wanted to understand what happened in February 1964 had to understand the Plaza's role in it. The building had turned itself into infrastructure for fame, a switchboard connecting celebrity to audience, artist to moment. This was the point of no return. The Plaza committed, consciously or not, to a new strategy. It would be the place where cultural events happened, where history unfolded, where the public came to witness something larger than a simple hotel stay. The building stopped pretending to be a private sanctuary. It embraced its role as a public stage, and that decision transformed everything that followed. But the strategy came with a cost. If you become a symbol for everyone, do you lose the exclusivity that made you valuable in the first place? The Plaza had built its brand on gatekeeping, on saying no, on making people feel special because they were among the few allowed inside. The Beatles weekend blew the gates open. Suddenly, the hotel was accessible not through wealth or status, but through association. You did not need to stay there. You just needed to know it existed, to have seen it on television, to have read about it in a magazine. The Plaza had democratized itself, and democracy, once embraced, cannot be reversed. Some long-term residents complained. They had paid for peace and privacy, and now they were living inside a tourist attraction. The building responded by carving itself in two. Some floors remained residential, quieter, shielded from the chaos. Other floors leaned into the spectacle, welcoming short-term guests who wanted to be part of the story. The Plaza became two hotels in one, a private club for those who could afford insulation, a public monument for everyone else. The 1960s accelerated the transformation. The Plaza hosted politicians, artists, and activists. It appeared in newspapers not just for society weddings, but for protests, scandals, and cultural shifts. The building became a mirror for the decade's contradictions, elegant and rebellious, historic and immediate, a place where old money and new ideas collided in lobbies that had not changed in 50 years. By the end of the decade, the Plaza had fully committed to a new identity. It was no longer a hotel that occasionally hosted famous people. It was a stage where fame itself was performed, documented, and amplified. This strategy would define the next 40 years. The building would open itself to cameras, filmmakers, and anyone who could turn its image into content. It would rent its identity the way other buildings rented rooms, and in doing so, it would discover that attention, managed correctly, could be more valuable than occupancy. But questions remained. If the plaza belonged to everyone who had seen it, who had imagined themselves walking through its doors, then who actually owned it? And if the building's value came from its role in the public imagination rather than its ability to house guests, then what did ownership even mean? These questions would haunt every owner who tried to extract profit from a building that had become, in the most literal sense, priceless. The plaza had made its choice. Culture first, rooms second. Now it had to learn to live with the consequences. Owners came, the plaza stayed. The names on the deed changed, but the building kept demanding the same thing: attention at any cost. Ownership became a revolving door. Every 5 to 7 years, a new buyer appeared with a new vision. They would renovate, rebrand, hire celebrity chefs and interior designers, spend millions trying to make the building profitable without killing the magic. And every time, the same pattern repeated. The plaza consumed the investment, looked beautiful for a season, then returned to its baseline condition: hungry, demanding, expensive, unyielding. Conrad Hilton bought the hotel in 1943, seeing it as a crown jewel for his expanding empire. He poured money into modernization, updated the plumbing, improved the kitchens, trained staff in the Hilton hospitality model. But the plaza resisted standardization. It was not one hotel among many. It was the plaza, and the plaza operated according to its own logic. Hilton sold it less than 2 decades later, the building having proven too expensive and too idiosyncratic to fit corporate systems. The Childs Company took over next, then Lawrence Wien and Harry Helmsley in a complicated leasehold arrangement. Each owner came with ambitions. Helmsley, a real estate mogul, thought he understood buildings. He renovated extensively in the 1970s and 80s, spent millions on the Palm Court restoration, upgraded suites, installed modern HVAC systems. The plaza looked better than it had in decades, but the operating costs still exceeded revenue. The building drank money and gave back prestige, which looked good in photographs but terrible on balance sheets. Donald Trump bought the plaza in 1988 for $390 million, the most expensive hotel purchase in history at that time. He promised to restore it to glory, to make it profitable through sheer force of branding. He renovated again, added his name to the marketing, hosted press events. But the mathematics did not change. The plaza cost more to maintain than it could generate in room revenue. Trump defaulted on loans within 4 years. The hotel went into bankruptcy, proving that even aggressive self-promotion could not overcome the fundamental arithmetic of a historic property that refused to compromise. A succession of corporations tried next. CDL Hotels International, Elad Group. Each brought expertise in hospitality management. Each believed they could solve the plaza's profitability problem. But the building had become something beyond a hotel. It was a landmark, which meant every renovation required approval from preservation boards. It was a union property, which meant labor costs remained high. It was a symbol, which meant the public had expectations that superseded business logic. The plaza belonged to its own mythology more than it belonged to whoever held the title. The pattern across decades was consistent: Owners arrived with confidence. They spent lavishly. They reopened with fanfare. And within a few years, they realized the Plaza was not a hotel that could be managed. It was a monument that had to be subsidized. The building burned through $60 million in renovations during one ownership period, $90 million in another, $450 million in a later transformation that converted most rooms to residential condos. The numbers kept escalating, but the essential problem never changed. The Plaza demanded more than it gave. Can an icon be managed or only survived? The question haunted every owner. Management teams came and went. Consultants proposed strategies. Marketing campaigns tried to reposition the brand. But the building itself remained unchanged in its fundamental nature. It wanted attention. It wanted to be beautiful. It wanted to be central to New York's cultural narrative. And it would bankrupt anyone who treated it like a normal business. The ownership cycles revealed something deeper about the nature of historic properties. They exist in a paradox. Their value comes from their unchanging nature, from being monuments to a specific moment in history. But that same unchanging nature makes them economically unviable in a world that rewards efficiency and adaptation. The Plaza could not be modernized without losing its identity, but it could not remain frozen without becoming too expensive to operate. Owners were trapped between preservation and profit, and the building always chose preservation. By the 2000s, the Plaza had become a case study in cultural economics. Universities used it to teach students about the gap between symbolic value and financial value. Real estate analysts pointed to it as an example of why historic properties should be subsidized by the state rather than left to private markets. But the building itself remained indifferent to academic debates. It simply continued existing, beautiful and expensive, waiting for the next owner who believed they could be the one to crack the code. The truth was darker and simpler. The Plaza did not want to be cracked. It wanted to consume, to take money, attention, and ambition, and transform them into its own continuation. The building was not failing. It was succeeding at its actual purpose, which was to remain the Plaza regardless of who paid the bills. Ownership was temporary. The building was permanent. And that permanence came at a price that no single owner could afford to pay forever. When a legend went on trial, bankruptcy is not a headline, it is a public humiliation, and the Plaza's humiliation had witnesses. In 1992, the hotel filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The filing was technical, a financial restructuring under Donald Trump's ownership. But the symbolism was devastating. The Plaza, the building that defined luxury, admitted it could not pay its debts. Creditors lined up. Banks calculated losses. The press covered every detail, turning the bankruptcy into a morality play about excess and failure. The courtroom became a stage where different parties argued about what the Plaza was worth. Creditors wanted assets liquidated. Trump wanted to retain control. Historic preservation groups wanted guarantees that renovations would continue. Unions wanted job protection. Guests wanted assurance that their reservations would be honored. Everyone had a claim on the building, and every claim contradicted the others. The bankruptcy exposed numbers that had been hidden behind the facade of success. The Plaza was losing millions of dollars annually. Operating costs exceeded $30 million per year. Revenue from rooms, restaurants, and events could not cover basic maintenance, let alone debt service on the loans used to purchase and renovate the property. The building was a beautiful disaster, and now everyone could see the math. But the bankruptcy also revealed something unexpected. Even in failure, the Plaza retained value. Not financial value, but cultural value that could be converted into financial terms under the right conditions. The brand alone was worth tens of millions. The address commanded premium pricing even in distress. Developers still wanted to own it, not because it made money, but because it made them important. The plaza had become too famous to die. Staff reported strange phenomena during the bankruptcy period. Employees working late in empty conference rooms heard voices in adjacent spaces, conversations that faded when doors opened. Maintenance workers found lights on in suites that had been vacant for days. Some blamed stress. Others blamed the building itself, as if the plaza was protesting its own dissolution. The grounded explanation was prosaic. Old buildings settle, wiring shorts, timers malfunction, staff under pressure misremember details. The plaza had motion-activated lights in some areas, heat-sensitive systems that triggered based on ambient temperature changes. Cold spots appeared near old windows with poor insulation, where drafts created temperature differentials that confused sensors. The famous suite everyone whispered about had aging HVAC ductwork that carried sounds from floors above, creating acoustic illusions. Expectation did the rest. Tell workers a building is haunted, and they will find evidence everywhere. But the ambiguity served the narrative. A haunted plaza was more interesting than a bankrupt one. Mystery softened humiliation. Guests booking rooms during the restructuring asked about the ghost stories. Tour guides added paranormal anecdotes to their scripts. The building, even in crisis, knew how to work an audience. The bankruptcy lasted 2 years. In 1995, a new ownership group emerged. CDL Hotels International and Saudi Prince Al Walid bin Talal acquired the property for $325 million. They promised massive renovations, full restoration, a return to glory. The plaza would be saved, but at a cost. The building would be split. Some floors would remain hotel. Other floors would be converted to condominiums, sold to private buyers as individual units. The plaza would become a hybrid, part monument, part investment vehicle. The transformation was controversial. Preservationists worried that converting hotel rooms to condos would dilute the building's identity. Long-term residents mourned the loss of the all-hotel experience. But the economics were clear. The plaza could not survive as a pure hotel. It needed capital infusions that only condo sales could provide. The building had to be partially dismembered to save the whole. What is the price of staying beautiful? For the plaza, the price was reinvention. The building had to accept that its future would not look like its past. It would never again be a pure hotel. It would be a brand, a landmark, a luxury address with multiple uses and multiple meanings. The bankruptcy had forced the question that owners had avoided for decades. If the plaza cannot make money as a hotel, what should it become instead? The answer was painful, but clear. The plaza would become whatever it needed to become to survive. Hotel, condo building, event space, film set, tourist attraction. All of the above simultaneously layered on top of each other in a structure that could no longer afford the luxury of a single identity. The bankruptcy had taught a lesson that could not be unlearned. Icons are expensive, and expense requires compromise. The plaza emerged from bankruptcy transformed, but still standing. The building had survived its public humiliation by admitting what it had always been. A fantasy that charged admission, a story that rented rooms, a monument that demanded subsidies disguised as investment. The trial was over. The verdict was survival. But survival, as the plaza was learning, is not the same as victory. the deal that changed the soul. At the breaking point, the Plaza made a bargain with the future, and it did not come cheap. The 2005 conversion was not a renovation. It was a reinvention. Elad Group, an Israeli real estate firm, purchased the Plaza for $675 million and immediately announced a plan that would have been unthinkable 20 years earlier. They would convert most of the hotel into condominiums. 152 luxury apartments carved out of what had been guest rooms. Only 132 rooms would remain as hotel space, operated under the Fairmont brand. The numbers told the story of transformation. 117 years of brand equity, built on the promise of being a hotel where anyone could stay if they had the money, was being restructured. 9 ownership changes, each trying and failing to make the pure hotel model work. 1 bankruptcy that proved the model was broken. 2 world wars that tested the building's relevance. And now, 1 essential choice: become culture, not just hospitality. The condo conversion solved the economics. Private owners paid millions for the privilege of a Plaza address. Those sales funded the renovation of the remaining hotel space. The building could finally escape the trap of trying to generate operating profit from rooms alone. But the conversion also fundamentally altered what the Plaza meant. It was no longer a public accommodation. It was a private residence with a hotel attached. The renovation took 3 years and cost $450 million. Every surface was touched. Plumbing replaced, wiring upgraded, marble cleaned and repointed, gilding restored. The Plaza that reopened in 2008 was physically the most perfect version of itself in a century. It gleamed. Every fixture worked. Every detail matched archival photographs. But something intangible had shifted. The building looked like the Plaza, but it felt like a museum. Critics called it Disneyfication. The accusation was that the renovation had made the building too perfect, too polished, erasing the patina of age that gave historic properties their character. The scuffs and wear marks that proved the building had been lived in. The Plaza now looked the way people imagined it should look, not the way it actually had looked. It had become a simulation of itself, and simulations, no matter how accurate, lack the soul of the original. But from a business perspective, the transformation was brilliant. The condo sales generated over $1.5 billion in revenue. Buyers included celebrities, foreign investors, and wealthy New Yorkers who wanted a piece of the legend. Some units sold for over $10 million, a record for residential real estate at that address. The building had finally found a business model that worked. Sell the dream in pieces and use the proceeds to maintain the facade. The hotel portion, now smaller, could focus on ultra-premium service without worrying about occupancy rates. The Fairmont Plaza became one of the most expensive hotels in the city. Rooms started at over $1,000 per night. Suites cost multiples of that. The strategy was clear: serve fewer guests at higher prices and make every stay feel like an event. Quality over quantity, experience over efficiency. But the soul of the Plaza had been traded for survival. The building that once welcomed anyone who could afford a room now reserved most of its space for people who could afford a whole apartment. The democratization that began with Eloise and accelerated with the Beatles had been reversed. The Plaza was exclusive again, but the exclusivity felt hollow. It was no longer about being part of a shared experience. It was about owning a trophy. The long-term residents, the ones who had lived in the hotel for decades, were forced to leave during the conversion. They received buyouts, but money could not replace the loss of a home. These were people who had made the plaza their permanent address, who had spent years inside its walls, who knew every staff member by name. Their displacement was legal and compensated, but it represented the end of an era. The plaza would no longer be a place where people lived full lives. It would be a place where people invested, security increased, access tightened. The lobby, once open to anyone who walked in, now felt surveilled. Condo residents had separate entrances. Hotel guests were tracked and managed. The building had become two separate worlds occupying the same structure, and the separation was enforced through design. You could walk through the lobby as a tourist, but you could not linger. You could book a room, but you could not explore beyond your reservation. The plaza had learned to protect itself from its own popularity. The deal that saved the plaza also changed what it meant to be saved. The building survived, but as something different. Not better or worse, necessarily, but different. It was still beautiful, still famous, still iconic, but it was no longer a hotel in the way previous generations had understood the term. It was a brand that happened to rent rooms, and brands, unlike hotels, live in perception rather than reality. The plaza had made its final bargain. It would trade intimacy for permanence, community for capital. The messy lived in feeling of a real hotel for the polished perfection of a luxury brand. The building would endure, but it would endure as a monument to itself, not as a living space. And monuments, once built, cannot change course. They can only stand, beautiful and empty, waiting for the next generation to decide what they mean. Hollywood rented the dream again. Movies did not just film the plaza, they used it as shorthand for the life people want. The building appeared in so many films that it became impossible to separate its actual history from its cinematic one. Audiences who had never visited New York still recognized the facade, the palm court, the lobby with its soaring ceilings and marble columns. The plaza became a visual cue, a single shot that communicated wealth, romance, and aspiration without needing exposition. Films used the plaza to compress storytelling. A character checking into the hotel told viewers everything they needed to know about that character's status. A wedding in the ballroom signaled a fairy tale ending. A business meeting in a suite indicated power and discretion. Directors loved the plaza because it carried meaning built over decades. The building did the narrative work for them. This was not accidental. The plaza actively courted Hollywood. It offered competitive rates for filming. It provided access to spaces most hotels kept private. It worked with production designers to ensure the building looked perfect on camera. Management understood that every film appearance was advertising that reached millions of people. A 30-second scene in a blockbuster was worth more than a month of traditional marketing. The strategy paid off in ways that compounded over decades. The plaza appeared in North by Northwest, where Cary Grant's character stayed before being mistaken for a spy. It featured in The Great Gatsby, reinforcing its association with old money glamour. It was central to Home Alone 2, introducing the building to a generation of children who would grow up dreaming about staying there. Later films used it again and again. The Wedding Planner, Bride Wars. The plaza became synonymous with weddings, even for couples who could never afford to host one there. But the relationship between the plaza and Hollywood revealed a deeper truth about how landmarks stay relevant. The building no longer needed to be the best hotel in New York. It just needed to be the most recognizable. Film appearances ensured that recognition stayed fresh, that each generation encountered the plaza through new stories. The building became timeless by constantly appearing in contemporary narratives. The contrast between public fantasy and private reality was stark. Guests who booked rooms based on what they saw in movies often felt disappointed. The rooms were smaller than they appeared on screen. The service, while excellent, was not magical. The Plaza was a real hotel with real limitations, but the films never acknowledged that. They showed only the beautiful surfaces, the perfect angles, the moments designed for maximum visual impact. Wedding bookings increased every time a bridal film featured the Plaza. Couples who had never considered the hotel suddenly wanted their ceremonies there. The Plaza capitalized on this by creating tiered wedding packages, ranging from modest events in smaller rooms to full ballroom extravaganzas. The building had learned to monetize other people's fantasies, to turn movie-induced desire into actual revenue. But does visibility protect a landmark or make it easier to sell? The Plaza's fame ensured it would never be demolished. No developer could tear down a building that appeared in dozens of films, that lived in the collective imagination of millions. The cultural weight made it untouchable. But that same fame also made it an asset to be traded, a brand to be licensed, a symbol that could be leveraged for profit by owners who had no sentimental attachment to its history. The Plaza appeared in advertising, television shows, music videos, and social media. It was constantly reproduced, endlessly photographed, perpetually present in visual culture. The building had achieved a strange form of immortality. It could never truly disappear because its image had been copied and distributed too widely. Even if the physical structure somehow ceased to exist, the Plaza would survive in archives, in films, in the memories of people who had never actually visited. This created an odd inversion. The real Plaza existed to support the imaginary Plaza. The physical building had to maintain itself in order to match the expectations created by its representations. Guests did not compare their stay to other hotels. They compared it to the version they had seen on screen. The building was trapped in a feedback loop, constantly chasing its own mythology. The Plaza had become more than a hotel. It had become content, a location that could be rented, filmed, photographed, and packaged for audiences who would never walk through its doors. The building survived by feeding the camera and the wedding album, by staying present in modern rituals of aspiration, by making itself endlessly available to be used as a symbol for something beyond itself. And in that endless availability, it found both its salvation and its prison. The only Gilded Age. Name-left chain hotels can copy the marble, but they cannot copy the memory that lives in a single address. By the 2010s, most of the Plaza's contemporaries had vanished. Hotels built in the same era, designed with similar ambitions, demolished or gutted beyond recognition. The old Waldorf Astoria at Fifth Avenue, gone, replaced by the Empire State Building. The original Ritz-Carlton, erased. The Knickerbocker, converted to offices. The list of disappeared landmarks stretched for pages. But the Plaza remained, and its survival was not luck. The building endured because it mastered something other hotels never learned: narrative management across generations. The Plaza did not just maintain its physical structure, it maintained its story, updating it constantly to stay relevant while preserving the core elements that made it recognizable. Each generation encountered a slightly different version of the Plaza, tailored to that era's values, but recognizable as the same essential place. Location helped. The corner of Fifth Avenue and Central Park remained prime real estate a century after the Plaza opened. The view never went out of style, but location alone did not explain survival. Other buildings sat on valuable land and still fell to developers. The plaza survived because it had become culturally protected. It was a landmark in the legal sense, but more importantly, it was a landmark in the collective imagination. Destroying it would feel like vandalism against public memory. The preservation battles began in the 1970s. Developers proposed tearing down the hotel to build a taller, more profitable tower. The city rejected the plans. Activists rallied. Celebrities signed petitions. The plaza was designated an official landmark, which meant any alteration required approval. The building had been saved by the same fame that made it expensive to maintain. Its cultural importance outweighed its economic inconvenience. But landmark status created new problems. The plaza could not modernize easily. Every renovation required navigating bureaucracy. Preservation boards scrutinized paint colors, fixture choices, even furniture placement. The building was trapped in amber, required by law to look like itself forever. This frustrated owners who wanted to adapt to changing markets, but it also ensured consistency. The plaza in 2020 looked remarkably like the plaza in 1920, at least from the public rooms. The building's dominance of cultural status came down to a simple formula: consistent visibility plus narrative control. The plaza appeared everywhere, but it appeared on its own terms. Management controlled access, curated press, and partnered with brands that reinforced the luxury image. Unlike newer hotels that chase trends, the plaza stayed stubbornly itself. It did not need to be innovative. It just needed to be the plaza. 117 years after opening, the building stood as the last surviving example of Gilded Age hotel architecture in its original form and function. Other landmarks had been preserved as museums or event spaces. The plaza remained a working hotel, a condo building, a cultural touchstone, and a business enterprise, all simultaneously. It had survived 2 world wars that disrupted global travel and trade. It had endured 9 ownership changes, each bringing different philosophies and financial structures. It had weathered 1 bankruptcy that exposed the gap between its cultural value and its operating costs. And through all of it, it had maintained the landmark-level expectations of perfection that guests demanded. What does it mean to own something the public believes belongs to them? Every plaza owner discovered the answer. You own the obligation to maintain it. You own the expenses, but you do not own the meaning. The building's significance belongs to everyone who has seen it in a film, read about it in a book, or imagined what it would feel like to walk through its doors. Ownership is a technical detail. Possession is communal. The plaza's success at outlasting its peers came with costs that balance sheets could not capture. It became a monument, which meant it could never fully be a home. It became famous, which meant it could never be private. It became iconic, which meant every change was scrutinized and every decision was public. The building had won the battle for survival, but it had lost the freedom to evolve naturally. It was frozen in its own mythology, required to perform the plaza forever, unable to become anything else without triggering a crisis. But in a city that demolished and rebuilt itself every generation, stability was its own form of power. The plaza stood as proof that some things could endure, that beauty, properly maintained and strategically marketed, could survive the relentless economics of real estate development. The building was not just a hotel, it was an argument. It was evidence that culture could win, occasionally, against capital. And yet the question lingered. Had the plaza truly won, or had it simply found a more elegant way to lose? The secret strategy. Nobody admits the plaza's real business was never rooms. It was permission. Permission to feel important inside someone else's story. Every guest who checked in was buying something more valuable than a bed and breakfast. They were buying the right to say they had been there, to post a photograph, to tell friends, to briefly occupy a space that existed primarily in collective imagination. The plaza sold access to a narrative, and narratives, unlike rooms, could be occupied by millions of people simultaneously. This was the secret that no owner wanted to admit. The plaza made more money from its image than from its operations. Licensing deals, film rights, brand partnerships, merchandise sold in gift shops to people who could never afford a suite. The hotel itself was almost incidental to the business model. It existed to support the brand, not the other way around. Children who grew up reading Eloise became adults who held their weddings at the plaza, not because the venue was objectively superior to competitors, but because their childhood memories demanded it. Couples who watched romantic comedies filmed in the ballroom wanted to recreate those moments in their own lives. Travelers who had never been to New York but had seen the plaza in films-booked rooms to confirm that the fantasy matched reality. The building survived by making itself emotionally useful to strangers. The strategy was ruthless in its simplicity. Appear in as many contexts as possible. Let the public assign meaning. Then monetize that meaning through whatever channels the market provided. The plaza did not care if you stayed in a room, bought a condo, attended an event, or just visited the lobby. Every interaction reinforced the brand, and the brand generated value that could be extracted through 1,000 different mechanisms. But this strategy required constant reinvention. The plaza could not rest on past achievements. Each generation needed a reason to care. For 1950s families, it was Eloise. For 1960s youth culture, it was the Beatles. For 1980s romantics, it was Hollywood weddings. For 2000 social media users, it was the Instagram backdrop. The building shape shifted constantly, absorbing new cultural moments and making them part of its mythology. The D.E. Plaza survived by refusing to have a single purpose. It was simultaneously a hotel, a residence, a tourist attraction, a film set, a wedding venue, a status symbol, and a public monument. This multiplicity protected it. If one revenue stream dried up, others compensated. If one audience aged out, another arrived. The building played every possible role, exploited every possible market, and never committed fully to any single identity. If beauty must constantly reinvent itself to survive, is that resilience or a quieter kind of loss? The plaza had become something its creators never imagined. Not a hotel where the wealthy stayed, but a symbol that the wealthy used to signal something about themselves. Not a private club, but a public performance space that charged admission. Not a building with a history, but a history that happened to occupy a building. The transformation was complete. The plaza had achieved what few landmarks manage. It had become more valuable as an idea than as a place. Its image circulated globally. Its name carried weight in conversations where the actual hotel was irrelevant. It had transcended architecture and entered pure symbolism, where it could exist indefinitely without requiring anyone to actually visit. But transcendence is cold. The plaza that survived into the 2020s was beautiful and famous and culturally significant. But it was also lonely in the way that symbols are always lonely. It belonged to everyone, and therefore to no one. It was preserved, protected, and perpetually on display. A museum of itself. A monument to the idea that some things should last forever, even if lasting forever means becoming something fundamentally different from what you began as. The plaza stood at Fifth Avenue and Central Park, limestone gleaming, chandeliers glowing, doors opening and closing on another evening, another event, another generation of guests who would photograph the lobby and add their images to the archive. The building had learned the lesson it needed to survive. Icon beats inventory, story beats structure, and survival, when it requires abandoning your original purpose, is both victory and defeat, inseparable and eternal. The hotel that refused to die had discovered the secret. You do not survive by staying the same. You survive by becoming whatever the audience needs you to be. And the audience, endlessly hungry for symbols to make sense of their own lives, needs the Plaza to keep performing. So it will. For as long as the lights stay on, the doors stay open, and someone, somewhere, believes that walking through a lobby can make them part of something larger than themselves. The Plaza's real business was never rooms. It was always permission. Permission to dream. And dreams, unlike buildings, never check out.